that they're going to get per gallon of diesel fuel. We need to try to tweak those specifications as we can, just to promote simple conservation. That's what we all need to do. The best thing to reduce greenhouse gases is to use less energy, regardless of where that energy comes from. So if we can focus on that too, don't forget about simple conservation is an effective strategy. And then, so that's where I would go from there. Thank you.
I'll jump into the void. In the Buildings, Land Use and Housing Committee, we've been talking about that a number of other states have implemented a major fraction of all the carbon that's being emitted from buildings is the carbon emitted from building the buildings, which is to say globally it's about 39% of carbon emissions are from operating buildings, and about 11% are from the ones we're building this year. Another 11% is from all the roads and other infrastructure we're building just this year. And so if we want to think about long-term impact, we want to sweep through our existing building stock and make it a lot healthier, more resilient, and lower energy using. And there's a kind of rate at which we can sweep through that. And obviously addressing the most vulnerable populations and groups, especially in neighborhoods that have been most neglected or ill-treated would be high priority. The rate of that having impact, that'll have a huge impact over the next 20 years. We also have targets from the governor to achieve big reductions really by 2025. And for that, what some states are doing on procurement are these so-called buy clean policies, where they identify, they look at, for example, concrete, and they say, among all the concrete vendors, here's the best 25th percentile of the lowest carbon materials. And we're just going to say that in our projects, we're going to require that state-funded projects, be in the top 25% or the lowest 25% of carbon intensity. And that can be written in a way that handles it takes into account all of the other goals that we have for growing local skills and so on. But it sets up a notion that there's always a distribution of some people who are doing it this way. And what we want to do is provide the incentive and use the power of the state procurement and then every 3 years, how it works, I know in Buy Clean California, is every 3 years they announce, okay, it's like that dance, the limbo, where the bar gets lowered or the bar gets raised every 3 years by just surveying what are current practices that are being achieved. So they start simple and then they broaden the band. So I just think that procurement is a huge possibility for improvement. And then the final thing I'd note is that when we talk about state policies, we actually have some pretty great state policies that are not actually being fully implemented and enforced. So back in 2001, a law was passed that requires all state buildings to report their energy use. You can't manage what you don't measure, and then identify the worst offenders for the targets for deeper, auditing and commissioning so that we can make those better. That's a huge workforce training opportunity. When I spoke with Mark Moses about this 8 years ago, when I first learned of this law, he said, just as soon as the legislature funds me a position to implement this, I'll be happy to implement it. And so it seems like in a Louisiana state budget, if we were able to speak up, this is like an easy base hit. And it's been shown in other nearby states like Alabama that benchmarking and auditing buildings is a huge way to improve their performance.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I'm hearing some themes here. Setting standards through procurement policies and slowly ratcheting them over time. Hearing that on the vehicle front and on the building materials front. And then enforcement, making sure we fully fund the enforcement that we need to actually to see the realizations of these policies as they were written and designed. Are there existing actions in development where those kinds of components could be added?
Can you say more?
Are on the land use and like from your committee, are there actions in development that that need to have these pieces added to them? you know,
I guess
whether
I would
it's
say is we could benefit from some staff help in those beautiful templates set very high goals for levels of specificity and calculating the impact of those moves and getting to those numbers, which are important, is going to need some degree of staff support, and we can follow up with that separately.
okay, great.
I can jump in here. As someone on the Housing, Buildings and Land Use Committee, one of the things that those of us working on an action proposal around compact development have discussed is the plethora of different arrangements already in existence between tax credit programs of various kinds, federal and state, and local zoning overlay strategies being deployed at that level. And part of the incentive structure set up at either the state level or the local level, and has been some kind of inclusion of local contractors, or, you know, and this varies by state. You know, Chicago's been very effective at tying contracting to participation in their TIF program. I won't necessarily say that they've been, that the outcomes have been as desirable as people hoped, but that there is a model there as to how to kind of dovetail some of these contracting goals with, and even kind of the mentorship and training support that could accompany not workforce development, but kind of like DBE progression to prime contractor status, for instance. Like that's been built into some of these tax programs, and those tax programs have been married with other kind of planning and policy objectives, and whether that is affordable housing, but also like environmental justice. So I think that there are ways to do this in the weeds. I think from a kind of high level strategy setting, it's a little bit less clear how one could do this at the scale of kind of like state policymaking, but there's certainly a role for the state to play in kind of tightening how local authorities pursue these different programmatic approaches.
Thanks, Fallon. Let's go Margot and then Jasmine.
So I find this really interesting because we're in the Manufacturing and Industry Committee. We're working on developing an action proposal that's a voluntary industry certification program that would basically give a ranking. So similar to how LEED is for green buildings, but this would be, for example, concrete. So it would give a variety of different parameters that companies could use, maybe looking at low NOx burners, or more efficient flare systems, or LDAR or something like that, to basically reduce their total carbon emissions and provide this ranking of some sort. And this is just a good tie-in for how that ranking could actually be used practically. Instead of just having a logo, it could be potentially tied into the state procurement, that it gives a certain amount of bid points or some sort of method for improving the companies that have higher ratings from the state level and local.
Jasmine, I think you're up next, and then Flozell.
Thank you so much, Allison. And I just wanted to circle back on something that Dr. Adu stated around DBE, and as a member of the Equity Advisory Group, something that we have set out since our initial meeting is that we are making sure that in the conversations that we're having, especially in these cross-sector working groups, that we are including equity at the top of the conversation and not something that we're thinking about at the backdrop. So as we think through contracting and procurement, I think that, again, looking at, as I kind of stated earlier, like what does the action plan look like and the intentionality look like to ensure that there's equity even with the primary contracting role. I think that sometimes with DBE allocation, a lot of that work tends to be limited or boxed into some of the subcontracting roles. And so we want to make sure just across the board that that's a part of the conversation at the start, and looking forward to exploring a little bit, even in this conversation, how do we go beyond what's traditionally been done, and ensuring that is something that is predominant and is effective.
Thank you for that, Jasmine. I will echo what you're saying on that front and remind us that there are actually some municipalities and agencies that have done quite a bit of work to make progress in that area. I'm fortunate enough to chair the Regional Transit Authority in New Orleans, and we've been able, through expert advice and working with colleagues across the country, to create some groundbreaking DBE strategies and policies, but also, to Jasmine's point, making sure that even our primes, we're taking into consideration two really important things. One is, like, what's the population and is it representative of the people being served? And also, what does the market analysis tell us? And so from everything that you might procure in this particular process, how do we know what the market will bear from a diversity and representation perspective? Those are things that we can measure and really be disciplined about adding to the procurement process. I'll add one other thing that we've been talking about at the Transportation Committee that I'm sure is part and parcel of what's been discussed at other committees, and that's keeping a strong eye on the GHG goals. And in as much as the inventory is being completed, making sure that all of the incentives and the ways we think about procurement are supporting the places where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck from an emissions perspective, and have some real discipline around that. We don't want to have, as other communities have seen, an emphasis on things that play a minor role in reducing emissions, leaving out some really great procurement opportunities and incentives to really hit some of the bigger targets from an emissions perspective.
Thanks, Flozell. Andrew, I think you're up next.
Andrew Jacoby, me?
Yeah.
Okay. I hope I'm not being overly specific here. I know in one of your first slides you mentioned the addressing the plug and abandonment issues and the methane associated with that. And I wanted to highlight one aspect that, and I'm on the Oil and Gas Committee. Well, we're obviously addressing that issue, but relating to contracting, I really think there's a wonderful opportunity for DBE and also for equity reasons that the contracting there should be scrutinized a little bit. And frankly, I don't know all the details about contracting when it comes to plug and abandonment using state tax dollars to plug orphan wells via the Orphan Site Restoration Commission using tax funds from the Oilfield Site Restoration Fund. But the commission itself, they manage the list of approved contractors. I don't know to what extent they support DBE. And I believe that they may even be using prison contractors, or at least I've read some articles to that effect, which may not always benefit Louisiana workers who are out of work. And it may also result in excess funds being used to pay the operators that are doing the plug and abandonment contractors, rather than going to Louisiana workers. And so there's some equity issues there that I don't fully understand, and that I think that some folks might want to look at more closely. Certainly I plan to, but there's some overlap that I felt like this group might be interested in. And I'll be forthright to say that I don't understand the issues yet, but I think that there's enough overlap with this committee's interests that maybe some folks could even send me an email and we could talk about it to work it into the proposed action items.
Yeah, and that's a great point. If you hear things from somebody on this workshop that you would like to talk about further offline and work into an action proposal, we encourage you to do that. Absolutely. So we're not going to have time today to touch every piece of this conversation that we need to and to get into the details needed. So we encourage that for sure. And it sounds like there are definitely some contracting issues with plug and abandonment that should probably be explored. So looking forward to seeing how we can work on that. Fallon, did you have, I see that your hand is still up on the participant. Did you have a follow-up or was that from before?
That's from before.
Oh, okay.
Apologies.
All good. So we're hearing a lot of, and I think Flozell raised a really great point that there are some examples that at the RTA and at city departments. Is Jeff Schwartz still on? I'm wondering if we can hear a little bit more about City of New Orleans and some of the pieces that have gone on there. He may have had to drop.
I don't see him. I think he dropped off.
Okay.
Eric is raising his hand.
Yeah, Eric?
Yeah, I did want to just talk about DBE participation for a minute. You know, our department, the Department of Transportation Development, we probably have one of the most active DBE programs in the state. And, you know, we encourage that. We're also one of the certifying agencies, as is the New Orleans International Airport and the RTA. There's only 3 entities which can certify DBEs under federal regulations in the state. You know, if you have federal funds mixed in with your state funds in pursuing these activities, it's very easy to establish DBE goals for different types of projects and services that you provide. I think there may be some obstacles if you're going with 100% state funding, unless you can get something written in specifically into legislation which allows that. So in one of the programs that we did have called the TIME program, it's from decades ago, it was actually written into the legislation that there was a certain amount of local hiring had to occur as part of that. Otherwise, it would not have been allowed if it was not in that legislation specifically. So to the extent that we can, if we can look for federal resources to combine with the state resources, we can set DBE goals. And you need to look at, before you set a goal, if you're going to be working in, let's just say in the New Orleans area, and you need carpenters and plumbers and electricians, you need to see how many DBE firms are available in that area before you start setting a goal for that. But that's one way to increase DBE participation. And there's also a small business program, which is race neutral, race and gender neutral. And we have that as well. And we set goals for that as well too. And again, you have to be certified to be a small business enterprise. And then the third program we have is basically an apprenticeship program. We call it an on-the-job training program, where young people can be taken into the profession. In our case, it's transportation infrastructure, and trained in that. And there's a credit given to the contractor, which offsets part of that person's hourly wages in order for them to be trained. And so those are existing programs we have that are specific to transportation now, but could very easily be expanded, I think, to other areas if we're retrofitting buildings. And even in the conversion of the vehicle fleet, our mechanics are not set up to handle hydrogen fuel cells, for example. So if we bought some hydrogen fuel cells vehicles, we could have it as part of the contract that there's a 5-year or 10-year maintenance component to that, and then put a DBA goal on there if we use some federal funds in the purchase of that. And then since we don't have any vehicle manufacturing plants or assembly plants in Louisiana, unfortunately we don't, but since we don't, the DBE participation would really come in the maintenance, the O&M of that vehicle fleet over that 5 or 10 year period. Those are just a few comments I have for you.
No, I think that's really helpful, Eric. Thank you. I see Maury from CPRA, and I would love to get your perspective on this, and then Flozell, we can go to you next.
All right, guys. Well, I'll tell you, the new guy who doesn't know anything that's going on was not going to open his mouth, but I wanted to follow what Eric said and give you the perspective of the coastal program, not specifically to the DBE part, but to the utilize local contractors, et cetera, et cetera. Early on in the Governor Edwards' first administration, there was a strong push coming from the Capitol. And I think, Harry, this might be before your time over there, but there was a big push about state-owned businesses, Louisiana-based businesses. And that they were pushing that. He was pushing that at press conferences and this, and it's a admirable thing. But as Eric said, that has to come through legislation. At the coastal program, we hire contracting services for engineering and environmental duty task, and then we bid out projects just like many of the other state agencies do for low bid for construction. There's nothing when we're selecting engineering firms, it's qualifications based. There's nothing in the law or the legislature that can steer us to provide more points in your scoring for a Louisiana-based business. Then we got down to the level of what actually is a Louisiana-based business. We have a mom and pop shop that has 2 or 3 people in it, but we look at a big national firm like Arcadis who employs 40 or 50, 60 people here in Baton Rouge or here in the state. How do you make that interpretation of what a Louisiana-based business is? And I'm not trying to muddy the waters. I'm just throwing this out that these are questions that have to be answered, particularly if state funds are going to go toward any infrastructure for this effort. I will say it put us in a awkward situation as we're reviewing engineering proposals, and the teams are setting up their proposals and stating on their cover letter or very, very upfront that we're a Louisiana company and all of our subs are Louisiana businesses. Your heart wants to help them because they're in your own backyard. However, there's nothing legally that we could do to provide extra points for that. And it kind of put us in a bind when it came to scoring. The team would win a selection on a project and they're from out of state or they're whatever. Well, they had the best qualifications and they're not necessarily from here, but so anyway, just some things to think about. If state funds are going to go into anything, the legislature has to do something. And but it's a quid pro quo because you're looking at, if you give the Louisiana company the edge up on a scoring for a particular submittal, the guys from Texas lose points on that. But what is Texas going to do? They're going to turn around and do the same thing against us for Louisiana companies who are trying to go to Texas to do work. Same thing with our sister states. If you're penalizing their workers for coming over here trying to get a job, then I can guarantee you that it will happen where Louisiana workers are going to have a more difficult time going over there to get work because they will set something up very similar. Just some thoughts to think about, and I'll stop talking now.
Yeah, thanks, Maury. I think to Maury and Eric's point, because we have a set of experiences, I think we can really make some recommendations that get right at the heart of what it means to create an authorizing environment and a permissive environment to consider things. Highlight this idea that there has been a lot of interest, both politically and at the community level, if you will, particularly in local communities, around highlighting local hires as well as opportunities for local businesses and all the different ways that can be defined. some of what we were able to do at the RTA, because we have a mix of funds that are both federal, state, and locally derived, we're able to create matrices that allow us to quite honestly navigate the different regulatory confines and match them with our stated goals and our values. And so, in addition to the DBE program, we have a small business and local business initiative, and we pay close attention to who's in the market, not only for what they're able to do in this moment or in this budget year when we're able to move our agenda in the short term, but we've also participated in activities and created initiatives that have been market making. What does it look like to grow the field, led businesses who may be near term from a qualifications perspective to be able to compete in 3 to 5 years? And so I think there's an opportunity for us to potentially recommend in this moment, particularly because we have procurement expertise at the state and local level in Louisiana, to maybe bring some of those folks together to reimagine a different policy platform, thinking about what needs to be changed in the legislature. Let's also not forget what can be done by way of executive action and order. There's some things there that are very possible that get us to both our greenhouse gas emissions as well as the representation that we're looking for to make sure that all Louisianans can participate in these blue and green economies. And where necessary, and it's so great that the design of this task force was created the way it was, because we have really talented folks, for instance, on the Equity Advisory Committee and the Scientific and others that can help give us some advice on those things as well.
A great point, Flozell. And just to follow up on that, on the Transportation Committee, kind of are any specific actions along those lines being developed, or were they at least discussed at the committee meeting last month, or is that more of a gap that would need to be filled?
Yeah, to Eric's point, I think earlier in the meeting, we're certainly discussing them. We haven't gotten to that level of detail yet. I think Z or somebody mentioned how there's a level of specificity that we're still working through, and also trying to answer some of the tougher questions, not only about what kind of, for instance, with regard to vehicles having lower emissions and the landscape, whether it's biofuels or electrification, working through some of the technical issues, as well as what are the sources, what is the pipeline, at least on the contracting side, that promotes not just the GHG emissions goals, but the diversity and representation goals. I think we're going to have to dig into the weeds on those. We're going to have to look at where those markets currently exist. We haven't quite gotten there, and I'm sure we're going to need some help, as I think I've heard from other committees. And so maybe there's a way for us to work together on that. And Eric, if I missed something, I feel like that's a fairly accurate.
I would agree with that, yes. And, there's opportunities, I think, to help Louisiana businesses, help people all across our state from all demographic groups in this effort. And we just have to be creative in how we do that. And it's going to take work, but I think we can get there. And, I did want to make one other comment about the building codes and things, and even the vehicle transition. Local governments, to the extent this is going to cost more, they're going to be looking for assistance in that. I mean, we can write specifications and they're going to, to retrofit buildings or whatever, and they're going to be looking at cost, and they're going to say, well, that's all well and good, but if this costs me 15% more, where's that money going to come from? So we have to be thinking about that if we're going to assist local governments in coming along with us.
Eric, that's a great point, and probably not just on the local level, right? I mean, if DOTD is evaluating a lower carbon footprint concrete, but it's more expensive, you plug less potholes or fix less, miles of road if you're using the more expensive, potentially more expensive material. And so how do you advance the development of that material, the low carbon material, but in a way that doesn't, perhaps compromise the primary mission of the agency or entity. And I wonder if there's not to pile too many follow-ups, but whether something like the Louisiana Transportation Research Center or other research centers to sort of facilitate that R&D and understanding within state agencies or local government agencies.
Well, I think, yeah, that we certainly can do that. I think in the materials arena, we would want to do a lot of testing. For example, if we can sequester carbon dioxide and more carbon dioxide in concrete, that sounds really good. I would want to do a lot of testing on the strength and durability of that concrete, for example, before we started building bridges out of it. So, or high-rise buildings out of it, because, you could have some dire consequences over the long term if we don't look into those kind of things. But, I'm sitting in an office with sheetrock walls. We could very easily go back to wooden paneling, and you can sequester a lot of carbon in wooden paneling. We don't make sheetrock in Louisiana. We grow a lot of trees in Louisiana. So that's a way to help Louisiana people and green fuels, Louisiana farmers. You can set some goals in there for participation by farmers from all demographic groups in Louisiana and help them in the green fuels industry. A lot of that green fuel costs more than regular fuel right now. I'm hoping the costs will come down over time, but right now it's more expensive. So we got to be thinking about that.
And if we're going to get into a building materials portion, I want to throw it back to Z and Fallon to chime in, because I think there's some interesting connections we can make between transportation and building materials here too.
Can I jump in real quick as we talk about things like electric vehicles and building materials? Something that came up in the legal advisory committee that I think is important to keep in mind during these conversations is the training in our workforce to ensure that they're capable of participating meaningfully in these industries. I think Eric mentioned when you talk about electrifying the fleet or switching to more efficient vehicles, if you don't have a workforce that can work with hydrogen cells, then how meaningful is the participation goal if you don't have a workforce that's been trained in these areas of maintenance and production? If we want to bring in these renewable technologies and increase solar panel usage, but we don't have workers here that are trained in building and developing and maintaining solar panels, how meaningful is that local participation goal? So just something to think about and keep in mind. I don't know if we have unions or trade schools involved in these conversations, but it might be something to keep in mind as we go forward.
That's a very good point.
If I don't want to jump the queue, but just to reply to both of those points, I think one of the other ways that when we talk about improving equity and outcomes that might be already enabled by, I think it's been brought up that state legislation might need to change. There's another way, which is that, where we live is still very sorted by both race and class. And what that means is that, if you want to find the poor neighborhoods in New Orleans, just look for where there aren't any trees. And we are not investing in something as simple as the urban tree canopy, which makes for about a 10-degree, I think there was a recent article about it's on average 10 degrees hotter in those neighborhoods that have fewer trees. It also means that the air quality is therefore worse. And so if we wanted to have an intervention that's in theory race neutral, but is incredibly impactful on equity, if we had a major initiative when we do our state and local and regionally funded transportation and roads projects, if we basically required an incorporation, a major initiative on urban forestry, it would have a huge impact given that people live where they live. So I think that it is possible, even within the current frameworks, depending on where and how we're spending the money in this infrastructure spending, rather than expanding, an interstate from 6 lanes to 8 lanes, if we expand the quality of our communities where our poorest and most discriminated against members are, it could have a big impact. I wanted to say that the development and maintenance of those urban forests is actually also a really great opportunity for workforce training and so on. I would say that actually, I believe we have a plant in Louisiana that recycles gypsum wallboard from construction sites and can reuse that. And that is actually the same price. The flyover that's being built at the New Orleans airport, I was informed just in passing by the concrete supplier, actually has the highest percentage of the alternatives to Portland cement as any, because it actually makes a more robust project. So I think it is possible that we sometimes talk about these, that they're going to cost more and that it's going to be worse for safety. And in fact, it becomes just a matter of making sure we're paying attention. And so we can make perfectly strong, safe buildings, perfectly strong, safe roads, and start to pay attention and reward the people who are looking for the techniques and technologies to make lower carbon options available. So I don't think it's always either or. I think sometimes it's both and.
If I could just jump in there real quick, Z, you're reading our minds actually on the Transportation Committee. And we were thinking even of reforesting blighted properties, removing the blight, which would be a big help to a lot of the cities, and then reforesting those blighted properties until they're reused at some point. But at least until then, expanding that tree canopy, much of which would be in the low income neighborhoods, would help with that heat island effect. So you're thinking along the same lines we were thinking.
If I could add in here, what I was going to raise a little bit earlier was the around, I guess, partly around the financing of these transitions at the local level. A lot of the things being suggested here have been developed in pilots elsewhere, and a critical part of those pilots have been use of CDBG funds, community development block grants. And Louisiana's kind of constraints on the CDBG program are much more restrictive than other states. And so our localities have not been able to compete for these federal philanthropic initiatives that would really drive not only opportunities for us to kind of make these development pattern changes on the ground, but also kind of add in workforce development initiatives, add in agricultural industry shifts and incentives. And in addition to that, kind of script in our various equity goals in terms of procurement and contracting. So I just want to kind of raise and to the fore the way in which the state authorizes its use of federal funds by its localities as an opportunity for us to grow the state's market of small businesses, but also the market for businesses that are operating elsewhere to operate here as well, open offices and employ Louisianans who do have that expertise to work in those fields, but are leaving the state to go work elsewhere on these kinds of projects. And I'm thinking, for instance, of like the Healthy Communities Initiative, which has a huge amount of philanthropic funding behind it and is kind of has a number of spinoffs now. And we are a state with healthcare professionals, with a lot of people who are health equity experts who have developed additional skill sets that kind of leverage that knowledge and their understanding of air quality and its effect on the population, all those kinds of things. There's so many opportunities for us to further develop the populace here around some of these initiatives that are happening elsewhere. And so I'd like to see some changes in the kind of authorizing of federal funds.
Let me follow up on that just to put a finer point on it. Is that a legislative fix, a regulatory in your experience, or kind of where would you pinpoint the an action to take?
I think it's a combination of legislative and regulatory. Some of the ways in which the funds can be used are restricted by kind of just rule making within our federal offices, but some of it is legislative rules around the use of funds, particularly around the fact that like the federal funds come with some of these some targeting towards certain relations and geographies. And so our kind of legislature has to authorize the use of federal funds in that way in this state.
Thank you for clarifying. Aaron, is that a new comment that you have, or is your hand still raised just from previous comment?
Oh, that was the previous hand raised when I just jumped in anyway.
Okay, well, the floor is yours unless you don't, unless you're good.
I'm all good. Thank you.
All right. Same with Eric.
I think something we haven't touched on yet, and I want to be able to hear from Jonathan, is the energy and kind of utility procurement side. And because governments are big bulk purchasers of power, certainly, and if we're trying to shift towards renewables, I think we need to at least discuss that side of this a little bit. So I'm wondering, Jonathan, if you have any thoughts that that we should consider here.
Yeah, sure. Largely, I'll start with kind of as utility, our procurement policies and generally, and as we move in more now to renewable energy, are largely dictated by rules set out by the Public Service Commission. And those, require requests for proposals and a pretty lengthy process to make sure customers are getting the best outcome, both in terms of economics and other areas that we're looking to fulfill by that. And so we go through that process. We are just as Entergy, and I think you're seeing this across the utility sector. Those requests for proposals that we're issuing right now through that process, our last two were entirely for renewable resources. And so that is certainly something that's expanding. How that relates, I think, to our customers, whether that be governmental customers or otherwise, in conjunction with that, one of the things we're looking at, and I think across the utility sector you're seeing is ways to bring that green energy to our customers through things like new tariffs that allow them to sign up under certain conditions, and their different pricing for that green energy. And so a customer could tap into that additional rider as part of their consumption to essentially get the green attributes of those resources we are procuring. That's one way. We're working through that process as things quickly evolve. We have one that is before the commission now in terms of just rec-based pricing, but I think we'll see more and more of those opportunities for customers to tap into what is a rapidly growing renewable portfolio for not only Entergy, but I think all of the utilities in Louisiana. And as far as our procurement policies, obviously as a private company, we set those, but we do place diversity and local contracting at a high level, and that is certainly part of that RFP process. It's part of all of our procurement strategies in terms of internal policies. But as we, and touching on the point we've talked to here, as we do develop that larger renewable portfolio, we do understand that our workforce will change too, and our contractors as well. And so making sure we have that workforce able to not only construct those facilities, but then maintain them over time is something certainly we're working towards as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, you have a big role as a as an employer too, in terms of the ways in which you can shift what's available. So I think, it's similar dynamics here in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no doubt. And we hear it, more and more every day in every customer communication we have. And it's been just in the last 2 or 3 years in every sector, industrial, governmental, residential, the want for customers to access that green energy. And it's top of mind for us.
Yeah, I think something that dovetails here is energy codes and energy efficiency codes, and the role in which the state's building code has in terms of setting those requirements. We currently don't have energy efficiency codes, I think, in the state building code, and I know that there's some. Well, there are some, and Z is going to correct me here for sure. But there are a lot of opportunities to set new standards for energy efficiency using the code. And then also something that Solomon brought up was retrofits, right? How do we go back and, this is not a state experiencing a high rate of new construction every year. And so how do we go back and ensure that those codes have a level of uptake within our existing building stock so that we can actually get some of those efficiency gains? So maybe we can talk about the codes aspect here for a little bit. Z, go ahead, and then Solomon.
Yeah, by the way, if you've raised your hand to ask a question because you want to ask a question, when you're done, you can click that same icon again to put your hand down if you've been able to answer your question or to make your point. We have a state energy code which was promulgated in 2007, and Texas even is now on the 2016 version of that code, and it seems to be able to have a vibrant economy for new construction. So it seems, it's been a long, long time. There is the authority for that board with a proper encouragement to adopt a more recent version of the energy code. Meanwhile, the building code is something I wanted to address because the international building code on which we have adopted, we're not as far behind on the building code, but the most recent version, the 2021 version of the international building code, actually would allow for the use of forest products. It's been determined to be safe to use mass timber in more forms of construction. And they set out requirements for how you can do that safely. And so were the state to at least kind of adopt down those sections, those new sections of the IBC, that could really promote for when we are doing new construction. Walmart's building a couple million square feet of mass timber office space up in their headquarters in Northwest Arkansas. Not that they're offering to do that down here, but we do have some of the best sustainably managed forests in the South here in Louisiana. And if we were to adopt the more recent versions of the code that other people smarter than, frankly, a lot of us smarter than me, have determined are safe and wise, it would help those industries here it could help those industries here in Louisiana.
Solomon, you want to chime in here?
Sure. I would like to see a statewide building energy code program. So as Z mentioned, we do have a statewide building energy code, which is actually 90.1 2007 and IECC 2009 for residential. What I want to say is we have a statewide building energy code that periodically review those energy codes, because even for ASHRAE or IECC, they review their energy codes periodically to remove outdated technologies and to add new technologies. And what I want to say is if we can develop a statewide building energy code and also review those codes periodically, we can update those codes and to reflect really what needed in Louisiana, because we have a unique hot and humid climates. And DOE and some other research institutes, they do those kind of generic cost analysis through building energy simulations. They sample the building stocks in a certain area, and then they develop building model. They call it prototype building models for commercial side, for residential side, or for industrial side. And then they try different, let's say, different insulation, different infiltration rate, and different window and all that. So they quantify, okay, if you update your 90.1 2007 to 90.1 2010, this amount of energy you can save, this amount of electricity or natural gas you can save, but this is the amount of money, extra money you have to pay. So I think we need this kind of a customized analysis specifically for Louisiana climates, Louisiana building stocks. And we periodically review our building energy codes, see whether the existing codes satisfy the need. If they do, the building codes satisfy the need, we're good. If they don't, we have to amend them to reflect the changes. That's one thing for building energy codes. Building energy codes are only for building for new buildings. How about existing buildings? For existing buildings, we need to establish some incentive program for building retrofit. I know Energy and Clayco have those incentives for their customers. And also, I know some federal programs, specifically USDA, have this program for agriculture producers and small business. So we needed to establish an incentive program for existing buildings. And also some private companies are willing to do this retrofit for building owners. Then they can pay off the cost from the energy savings. Let's say they do the retrofit and they projected your annual energy saving is $50,000, and they're gonna sign a contract with you. And once you have the savings, they took a portion of the saving in the next few years to pay off the cost. So that's what I can see. We can leverage existing financial resources to increase the energy efficiency in buildings for both new and existing buildings. And another thing I want to point out is in this process, it's a lot of training, and you can create a lot of jobs, because I do this building energy audit by myself. The one thing I talked to some other private companies to do this building retrofit and assessment. They all complain they need people to do this kind of work, but there is a lack in education, in training, because I teach HVAC and building related courses. And whenever I ask my students, what are you going to do after you get your bachelor degree in mechanical engineering? Most of the time, I want to find a job in the oil gas industry. I want to go to aerospace, and only a few they want to do HVAC related or energy related. So apparently there is a training process. And I'll say we can create a lot of job opportunities in this training process. That's all.
Thanks. I know Jonathan wanted to respond, and I think Fallon should chime in here as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was having trouble getting off mute. I just wanted to, we certainly do, Entergy and Cleco and all the investor-owned utilities in Louisiana do have those energy efficiency incentive programs that are open to all of our customers. I will say they are generally, because of the way they're structured now at the commission's direction, I guess relatively small. I do think there's changing rules at the commission now that would expand those and provide more funding for those to be available to interested customers.
I think along the same lines, Solomon mentioned about we needing to do a kind of review and audit of what's going on statewide. And we have not had a comprehensive audit of the way in which like historic tax credits and other financing for rehabilitation of existing structures, how that funding is being utilized throughout the state and by what kinds of companies. And I think that we really would need to have that kind of baseline information before rolling out any new incentive programs. And one of the things that I've noticed in working with a team of people who have been evaluating the impacts of the kind of post-disaster funding bonanza is that there are these wealth gaps that get baked in pretty early on in these kind of initiative rollouts that are really difficult to redress 5 years in. And some of that is because we're in the interest of making the funds available and getting the businesses on board. There wasn't a lot of attention spent to designing the actual frameworks within which, let's say, a small business in one of the more rural parishes is able to become integral to the way in which we do these kinds of auditing, let's say like building audits or broader resilience audits get conducted. And so companies that have far more employees, far more capital base, are able to really kind of corner the market, so to speak. And we leave a lot of prospective business development within the state behind. So I think that there is a lot of track record that we need to actually get on paper empirically and understand what it is that we're working with so that we can kind of heat off some of these challenges down the line. And I just want to add, as somebody, I'm a preservation consultant and a professor of planning and preservation. And one of the things that often comes up in my work in actually doing kind of retrofit rehabilitation work is that most localities here and elsewhere, quite honestly, don't have a really good data set on the physical built environment. Like, what is the actual condition of what we have? And that establishing that base of knowledge is critical to even being able to scope projects. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity to partner with technology firms that are rapidly trying to become the resource for this information. There's obviously other kinds of ethical issues around that, but I think it is worth this, like for instance, the city of New Orleans has partnered with a variety of entities to beef up its, kind of data-driven decision-making. I think that this is one of the areas that hasn't really been fleshed out with those kinds of partnerships. But with it, we can then add on like energy audit data that and kind of joining all these new data that we're collecting, presumably through the rollout of some kind of climate adaptation initiative. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Fallon. I think that's a really great point, that there's a certain amount of baseline data collection that we might need to be able to formulate some of these actions we're talking about. And I think building retrofits is a great example. And so, there might be an action in this, we might need to like set ourselves up to do that kind of data collection and say, like, we can't actually make decisions on program design yet without first, embarking on more of a data collection process so we understand how to scope a program like that. I think that's a really great point. I think Z, you're up next.
I had a question, since we have energy on this call, but not on our buildings and energy group. When I arrived in New Orleans 12 years ago, I said, so where's your building benchmarking database? And they said, oh, the way that you have to fill out this form if you want to find out the energy use that a building's doing. And it was a form that had been worked out titled Declaration of Legal Incompetence, because it was a form you filled out in order if your elderly parent was getting a little bit overwhelmed by understanding the bills and you wanted to make sure the utility bill got paid. They said, well, it would take thousands of hours of lawyers' time to change that to allow disclosure of energy use, and we're not sure we want to spend that. I think there's an allyship possible between the utilities and the groups that are working for better buildings and healthier buildings, which would be to allow easier disclosure of how buildings are actually performing. Entergy obviously knows how much all these houses in their service territory, how much energy those buildings are using. And while there's a lot under the control of individual occupants, there's a lot that's not. And if we could use the data sets, get anonymized access to the data sets to start analyzing what's going on, we could much better design the programs. We could also allow informed decisions when people are renting if we were labeling units by their, their average energy use. It's done in a lot of other areas. It is not an invasion of privacy. It's no more an invasion of privacy than the EPA sticker on a car when you're looking at to buy a car. So in the past, I've been told that the utilities resisted this. I'm hoping that that's not currently their position. And what I'd like to do is invite and just say that you guys have the data that's necessary to make good policy. And what we need to do is find out how do we have to, if we have to alter the laws and the regulations that govern you to allow that to be used, well, let's do it. Let's stop just saying, well, we'd love to, but we can't.
Yeah. To be honest, first time but happy to discuss it further on that. I mean, obviously there are privacy concerns, but I don't know the details of the exact request and prior discussions on that, but happy to take it offline and talk about it. I'm in Louisiana, but I'm sure, so, I'm Entergy Louisiana, but I'm sure we're operating under the same rules on that front. So we should definitely discuss.
I think that's a great follow-up, and I don't know, I know Brandon Fry isn't on this, but perhaps looping him in as well, and Aaron Spears for, City Council of New Orleans for regulating Entergy New Orleans.
Definitely. I mean, some of that might not be, some of that might not be commission regulation, the privacy concerns, but certainly we would include Brandon in trying to figure out the best path forward on that.
I had a question when we're talking about purchasing. We've talked about in some states, there's the possible that individual ratepayers can check off and you pay an extra 2 cents a kilowatt hour for clean electricity. Recently, it's turned out that on average, the clean electricity is actually cheaper, but we won't go there. The intermediate position is that states and state agencies and cities could choose to purchase a kind of a cleaner mix. And so I guess I'd be curious what the, what the attitude is among the various utility players that you've been working with towards enabling that. A lot of states have had much more aggressive renewable portfolio standards in their state mix. Our current Public Utilities Commission is not heading that way. They seem to be heading the opposite direction. So the question is, for this governor's appointed task force, what are the things that we could do that could have an impact quickly that would move us in the right direction?
Yeah, sure. And the question of, what actually can be done by each entity, I think is a good one, and one that, will have to be worked through, because obviously we are, regulated by the commission, as you noted. But just as far as what we are doing, I think people know, just I can speak for Entergy only, we have stated our goals about reaching net zero by 2050. And I, admittedly, right now our renewable portfolio is not large, but it is rapidly growing. We're currently soliciting 800 megawatts in Southeast Louisiana of solar resources. And I touched on this earlier, but getting access to those resources from our customers is something we are actively pursuing. We currently have a proposal in front of the commission right now that would allow, residential customers to pay that, REC-based pricing to get the green energy from an existing facility. But as we move forward into a larger portfolio, it would be more, in our mind, associated with all the benefits and cost of those resources. And And so if they wind up being, lower cost energy, then that benefit could be passed forward. But certainly something we're actively working towards as we build out the portfolio that would underlie those offerings to customers. And we see that, those resources, that 800 megawatts we're looking at is in the 23, 24 timeframe to build out. And we expect that it'll, annually follow. We'll be issuing those kind of renewable RFPs. I'm speaking for energy. I see it across the utilities in Louisiana with CLECO and SWEPCO and even the cooperatives. So I do think that we are admittedly a little behind on the percentage of renewables we have in our portfolio, but I think that's rapidly changing.
And if I could just mention, in New Orleans, in our last rate case, we added the green option to bills, and I think that's what you're referring to in terms of like customers having an option. And we are wrapping up our renewable and clean portfolio standard. The goal is to have something before the council next month. So if you want more information on that or what's happening there, I'm happy to send that to you offline.
Great, thank you. Eric, do you have a comment? I see your hand's been raised, but I didn't have the gold one.
No, I did not.
And Fallon, I think your hand is still up too.
I just lowered it. I just realized.
We're all fumbling through it. We have about 5 or so minutes left in the discussion. So I'm wondering, I'm going to look back through my notes here and kind of provide an overview of some of the things I've heard today. And then maybe we can talk for the last few minutes about how to apply what we've discussed to some of these specific actions, or maybe develop some new ones. So there might be some cross-sector needs that have come up today that that y'all would want to work on outside of your specific committee work. So we've heard about fleet conversion and setting standards with bid competitiveness as an aspect. We've heard about buy clean policies for at a state level for building materials and road infrastructure materials. We've heard about Fallon brought up the impacts of combining tax credit with zoning overlays and making sure that we're managing performance and equity objectives through incentive programs. Voluntary industry certification, I think manufacturing and industry is already working on that one. We've talked about, what else? Looking at agency examples of strong DBE programs like at RTA and the way in which they've combined the power of demographics with market analysis and made some of those matrices to allow them to really target their procurement goals. I think that's a great example and something that could probably apply in a number of cases in which mixed funding streams have different regulations and different rules attached to them. On the job training, especially for mechanics, I think training in general, making sure that that when we make these bigger transitions, that we have workers who are trained to do the work that we're going to need for some of these newer technologies. We talked about our coastal program and the ways in which that can be, some of the challenges that that Maury talked about with geographic preferences. And, there's probably some other state agency procurement lessons that we can learn from what CPRA has been doing over the last few years, just given the number of procurements and the variety of procurements that happen through CPRA. Creating an authorizing environment for local hiring and local businesses, and the need to create a punch list for legislative action and executive action. I think that's a really specific implementation work that needs to be done on many of these actions, is coming up with that punch list of who needs to do what to enable this type of work. Let's see. We talked about maybe adjusting some of the CDBG implementation and authorization regs, looking at the state energy code and the state building code, and maybe doing some more programmatic and data collection work on that side, and researching how those codes can be better tailored and applied to our specific building stock and climate and weather challenges, auditing historic tax credit use, and really thinking about program design for things like building audits to avoid the market cornering dynamics that we've seen in some post-disaster type programs. Looking at getting a data collection effort for building stock, including potentially some anonymized data from utilities, and then encouraging more customer choice for renewable energy in general. So wow, that was a lot. Really great variety of things that we talked about today. So I think there's some opportunities here for adjusting our existing actions as well as creating some new ones. So I'm curious if anybody has any other thoughts on kind of ways to take this discussion and apply it to the work that we're doing.
I would just throw in, there's one, it sounds small, but it could be potentially big. Again, impact on kind of health, which is, I always find people seem to respond more generally to their personal health than that of the planet. But one of the things we found is that the use of natural gas inside buildings is correlated with health challenges and due to kind of an underappreciation of the particulates generated and the kind of uncertain ventilation of existing buildings. So what that means is that things that prepare us for decarbonize, we know that the grid is decarbonizing eventually. And what that means is that with our projects, we're moving people away from starting off with eliminating combustion within the building and then eventually getting into combustion that's outside the building. So we know that Louisiana is a natural gas state, and yet we also know that the grid is decarbonizing, and no one believes that we'll all be burning natural gas inside our houses 50 years from today. So the question is, how do we make that transition in an equitable fashion? And so I think programs that focus on the impact of health have a huge economic benefit. In other words, you run the numbers, and converting people off of natural gas stoves inside their houses to high performance electric options like induction cooking can have a big positive impact on their health. And it happens every time they change out their equipment, as long as the wiring supports it. And getting the wiring to support it means we need the workforce trained to do that kind of thing. So I think that there are steps as we map out the transition over the next 30 years that we could start on today. Other states are way ahead of us on electrification, but the first step is getting our grid cleaner, is putting those things in place. But the other thing is to think about the things that would have the biggest positive impact on people's health, especially poorer communities, and that's an example of one.
I'd add that, I mean, a lot of what we've discussed today, but I think in a lot of the different committees independent of this conversation have been changes in, land use and, building performance more broadly speaking. And all of those things have documented health benefits, individual and public health benefits across all demographics. And so I think that there is a kind of action proposal that brings all of these things together. I think the language of that proposal at the kind of top level of it will have to address, I think, what's already going on right now in our political discourse, which is that people have a particular way of understanding infrastructure. And when you inform them that there are other ways of thinking about that, it's like, oh, well, you're talking about something entirely different. I think in the same ways, if we're saying we're talking about the health of people, just to help the planet. People feel that these are on completely different like planes of thinking, and there's a lot of work to be done there in wedding these in the kind of public consciousness, not just in a kind of research base.
Thanks, Fallon. I think that's actually a great place to stop for today. So I'm going to turn it back over to Harry, and we'll do next steps and then have a comment opportunity.
Thank you all. Yeah, that was a fantastic discussion. Appreciate all your contributions to it. Looking ahead, just a reminder, as I went over at the beginning of this workshop, we're developing on our actions and strategies on 2 different levels. So again, action proposals are due at the end of this month. And to our advisory group members, please be on the lookout for surveys for next week on the to evaluate the consequences of the strategy portfolios that are we are modeling for everybody. Looking ahead, so again, this is how to submit your action proposals. Please submit them by the 30th. You can send them via email. You can do them via the Google form and just click send, or you could use snail mail and mail it to the address typed in here to our office. Just as a note, the action templates are found on our website, and they are available in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. So please let us know if you need any assistance in kind of furthering the development of these action proposals. Please share with anyone you think would be interested in submitting one their own, whether involved in this climate initiative or just a member of the public who is interested. So we look forward to getting all those proposals in at the end of this month. Next slide. And so, again, we are, this is a very organized process that we are, working on these two levels, and we were really looking forward to evaluating on these 2 levels, both the higher levels strategy level, and then also, we are going to be continuing to work on these action proposals and further distill them, further refine them, because really, as I think this conversation has underscored, the devil is in the details, and in terms of identifying those roadblocks and optimizing to actually make move the ball forward. And so really looking forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. I hope you all continue to engage with each other offline. There are only so many official meetings that the planning team can host and convene, but we would hope that you continue to have these conversations offline with each other, with your colleagues, and with members of the public. And so
that's actually all I have.
All right.
Slideshow.
Well, then with that, I will
Harry,
we'll look at.
Before you go, is this a public meeting, and do you need to offer public?
We are about to go to public comment.
Okay. Right.
Although we do not have a quorum of any of the committees or advisory groups or the task force, so I think that does not make it a public meeting for open meetings law, but we are complying with open meetings law because that is just generally good practice. And so we will, I believe, first go to the attendees. Buck Vandersteen, I know I've seen your hand up, and I've just unmuted you if you would like to share any comments. The floor is yours. That might have been, I think that hand was raised for quite a while, so perhaps not, no longer a comment.
I am here. Can you hear?
Oh, sorry.
Very good. I'm Buck Vandersteen. I'm the executive director of the Louisiana Forestry Association. And several of the things that we're very concerned with is keeping our forests as forests, which means building wisely and making sure that the building codes are encouraging the use of energy efficient wood products. Z mentioned and Eric both mentioned wood paneling, mass timber, cross-laminated timber. All of these products we can use more of if our building codes are modified to receive those products. And when we do that, we create opportunities for the landowners that are growing the product, the loggers that are producing it to the mills, and then the mill workers. And I think Z mentioned the project with Walmart when they announced the construction of their corporate office all out of cross-laminated timber and mass panel products. There was an industry that came in that produced that just for that role. So we have a tremendous opportunity in Louisiana to sequester more carbon, to build more responsibly with wood, and to generate economic opportunities for rural Louisianians for managing, harvesting, transporting, and building forest products. So thank you for the opportunity to join you. And I'm on one of the other committees, but I thought this was an interesting discussion today. So I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Buck. And Vale, I saw you dropped some comments in the chat, but I wanted to make sure you had anything to share. I unmuted you if you would care to share any comments, and if not, that is fine as well. All right, well, Anne? Hearing none. Well, except for some feedback. All right, well, let's now look at the board is clear on the climate at la.gov email. And I hope I'm hearing some feedback, so let's adjourn this.